He did his best, I suppose, but what can you expect? He's a blue-collar fool. The words slid out of my son-in-law Mark's mouth so easily, wrapped in a smug chuckle as he spoke to one of his country club friends. They were standing by the grand fireplace, the one I'd built with my own 2 hands, stone by stone. Every joint mortared, every stone leveled, all of it a monument to the love I had for my daughter Sarah. And now, in the very house that my sweat had paid for and my skills had raised from the dirt, I was being dismissed as a fool. For 40 years, I'd worked as a carpenter, a general contractor. My hands are a roadmap of that life. Scarred, calloused, permanently stained with the ghosts of wood varnish and concrete dust. Those hands had paid for Sarah's college degree, for the down payment on this very piece of land. They'd spent the last 18 months framing these walls, hanging this drywall, laying these hardwood floors until my back screamed and my knees ached. Also, she and Mark could have a fortress of suburban success. And for what? To be the punchline of a joke, delivered by a man in a $1,000 suit who wouldn't know a load-bearing wall from a decorative pillar. A cold, heavy silence seemed to press down on the room, or maybe that was just in my own head. The cheerful chatter of the housewarming party faded into a dull buzz. I saw my daughter Sarah standing a few feet away. She heard it. I saw the flicker in her eyes, a tiny, aborted movement as if she might speak up, but it died before it was born. She just took a sip of her wine, her gaze dropping to the gleaming floor I had polished for her, and in her silence, she co-signed his cruelty. That was the moment that truly broke me. Not Mark's insult, but my daughter's silent assent. The world stopped. The crystal wine glass in my hand felt impossibly heavy. The laughter from across the room sounded like it was coming from a million miles away. All I could see was the smirk on Mark's face, a look of casual, unthinking superiority. How did we get here? How did the little girl whose scraped knees I used to bandage, whose playhouse I built in the backyard with scrap lumber, become this woman who could stand by and watch her father be humiliated in her own home? My mind slipped its anchor, drifting back through the years, away from the glittering party and the sting of those words. I saw a much younger me, promising my late wife I'd make sure Sarah never had to struggle the way we did. I remembered working double shifts, taking every side job I could get, my body a machine I pushed to its absolute limit, all to fill her college fund. I remembered when she brought Mark home for the first time. He had a limp handshake and eyes that sized up my small, worn-out house with a polite disdain. He talked about portfolios and acquisitions, words that felt foreign in my world of sawdust and support beams. I saw their wedding, and the check I gave them, nearly everything I had saved for my own retirement so they could have this land, this dream. "We'll need your help building it, Dad," Sarah had said, her eyes shining. "No one builds a house like you." And like a fool, a blue-collar fool, I believed her. I poured the last of my strength, my expertise, my soul into this house, thinking I was building a future for my daughter. I never realized I was just building the stage for my own humiliation. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and shame. Each one seemed to pulse with the words, "Blue-collar fool, blue-collar fool." The old truck, my faithful companion for 15 years, usually felt like an extension of myself, but tonight it felt like a clunky, outdated relic, just like its driver. The scent of pine air freshener and old leather, once comforting, now seemed to underscore everything I wasn't. New, polished, sophisticated. I pulled into the driveway of my small, boxy house, the one I'd built with my own hands for me and Sarah's mother. The sight of it, with its slightly crooked shutter I'd never gotten around to fixing, hit me with a fresh wave of nausea. It wasn't just a house. It was a testament to a life of almost. Almost enough money. Almost enough time. Almost enough to be proud of. Next to the sprawling, custom-built estate I'd just left, it looked like a child's drawing. Inside, the silence was a physical presence. It was the silence of a life lived alone. a stark contrast to the curated champagne-fueled noise of Sarah's party. I didn't bother with the lights. I navigated by memory, my boots scuffing against the worn hardwood floor until I found my worn armchair. It sighed as I sank into it, the springs groaning in familiar protest, as if sharing the burden of my weight. And then, in the dark, it all crashed down. It wasn't a slow creep of sadness. It was a dam break. A raw, guttural sound tore from my throat, a sob I didn't even recognize as my own. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to push the images back in. Mark's smirk, so casual, so effortless, the way Sarah had looked at him, a faint indulgent smile on her lips, as if his cruelty were just a charming quirk. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't defended me. She had simply absorbed the insult, accepted it as part of the evening's ambiance. The city lights bled into streaks of gold against the deepening twilight as I drove. The silence in the car was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the hum of the engine and the echo of that laugh. Her laugh, sharp and bright, a sound I once lived for that now felt like a shard of glass in my side. I was a ghost in my own story, a rough draft that had been edited out of the final, glossy version of her life. My gaze drifted across the dim living room, landing on the fireplace mantel. A gallery of my failure. There was a photo of Sarah at 7, grinning a gap-toothed smile, perched on my shoulders at a county fair. Another of her high school graduation, her face bright with a future I was so proud to have helped build. And right in the center, their wedding photo. Sarah, a vision in white, beaming. Mark, handsome and poised in his tuxedo. And me, squeezed into a rented suit that felt like a costume, my face a mask of forced joy. I had given them the check that day. I remembered the feel of the paper, the weight of it. It wasn't just money. It was my freedom, my security, the final sum of every double shift and sacrificed weekend. I'd handed it over with a heart swollen with love, thinking I was investing in her happiness. O parágrafo foi removido conforme a sugestão. I never realized I was just building the stage for my own humiliation. The silence in my own small house pressed in, agreeing with me. It was the silence of the obsolete. The grief didn't lift so much as it curdled, turning from a heavy, suffocating blanket into something sharp and acidic in my gut. In the days that followed, I moved through my small, silent house like a ghost, the memory of that beautiful, mocking home on the hill, a constant throbbing ache behind my eyes. Selling my tools felt like the final surrender, the official admission that the craftsman, the provider, the father who built things, was dead and gone. The workshop was a tomb of my former self. Sawdust coated every surface, a fine grey shroud over table saws, planers, and the beloved band, saw that had sung its steady song for 20 years. My fingers, calloused and familiar, traced the outline of a chisel, and I felt a phantom pain, the memory of 1,000 cuts and blisters that had once meant progress, creation. Now they meant nothing. It was as I was clearing a shelf, my movements robotic, that my knuckles brushed against worn, gritty leather. I pulled it out. My project book. The leather was soft and scarred, stained with coffee and something I suspected was a drop of blood from a long-forgotten nick. I hadn't looked at it since the day I'd driven the final nail into Sarah's house. I'd considered burning it. I sank onto a dusty stool, the weight of the book heavy in my lap. I opened it. The spine cracked in protest. There, in my own tight, precise script, the handwriting of a man who understood that a misplaced decimal could bring down a wall, was the entire story. Not the story of betrayal I'd been telling myself, but the story of the build. Page after page of measurements, material costs, structural calculations, and little notes to myself. Check load-bearing capacity on beam A3. Verify plumbing rough-in with county inspector. It was a map of my devotion, written in graphite and sweat. Then I saw it. An entry from early on, just after we'd broken ground. The heading was simple. Site analysis, North Side Foundation. My writing here was different, the letters a bit more forceful, pressed deep into the page. I'd done a perk test myself, sinking a post-hole digger and examining the soil. It was an unstable mix of sandy loam and clay, the kind that shifts and settles with the seasons. I'd written a detailed warning about the soil composition, recommending we pour deeper, reinforced footings to compensate. I'd even sketched a quick diagram showing how a standard foundation could potentially list over time. The memory didn't just return, it slammed into me, vivid and whole. I was standing on the bare plot of land, the blueprints rolled out on the hood of my truck. Mark had come by after his work, still in his crisp, button-down shirt. I pointed to the north side, my finger tapping the soil report I'd paid for out of my own pocket. "Mark, we've got an issue here," I'd said, my voice all business. "The soil's no good. It's greedy. It'll swallow a standard footing whole over a few wet winters. We need to go deeper, add more rebar. It'll cost a few extra $1,000, but it's non-negotiable. The integrity of the entire north wall depends on it. Let's not blow the budget on dirt no one will ever see." What else could I do? It was his money, his house, his daughter. I'd poured my own money into it, my own sweat, but in that moment, my expertise was just an opinion, and his was the final word. Sitting there in the dust-choked silence of my workshop, the ledger open on my knees, that memory was no longer a source of pain. It was a spark, a dry, hot little ember that caught in the tinder of my grief and began to smolder. He hadn't just dismissed my advice. He'd dismissed my entire life's language. The language of plumb lines and load-bearing walls, of things that were true and straight and solid. My knowledge wasn't foolishness. It wasn't the punchline I'd believed it to be. This ledger, filled with the unassailable facts of my trade, was a detailed, cold-blooded record of his arrogance. A strange calm settled over me. The fog of grief burned away, replaced by a crystalline, sharp-edged clarity. I looked around the workshop, no longer seeing a tomb, but an arsenal. My tools weren't relics of a failed life. They were extensions of my will, my knowledge. He had saved a few $1,000s. He had chosen pretty finishes over a solid foundation. And foundations, I knew better than anyone, have a way of speaking up eventually. They whisper at first, hairline cracks in the drywall, a door that won't quite latch. Then they start to talk. A low groan in the night, a slant in the floor that a fancy rug can't hide. And sometimes, if you've built your beautiful life on a lie, the foundation finally screams. I closed the ledger. I didn't put it back on the shelf. I placed it squarely on my workbench. I picked up a rag and began to wipe the fine grey dust from my table saw. The metal gleamed dully in the weak light. I wasn't going to sell my tools. I was going to sharpen them. I didn't know what I was going to do with this new cold fire in my chest, but I knew one thing with the certainty of a man who had spent his life understanding structures. Nothing built on a weak foundation lasts. And I was the only one who knew just how weak his was. The cold resolve felt like a new kind of muscle, one that had atrophied from disuse and was now, with a painful, thrilling ache, flexing for the first time. It wasn't about rage anymore. Rage was a fire that burned hot and fast. This was different. This was tectonic. It was the slow, immense pressure of one continental plate deciding it would no longer yield. I opened the ledger again, not to the final damning entry, but to the very first page. I wasn't just reading numbers and material lists anymore. I was reading a story. My story. The story of the ground breaking, of the deep, honest hole I dug for the footings. I remembered the feel of the late autumn chill, the smell of damp earth, and Mark standing at the edge, looking impatient. He'd wanted to pour the concrete a day early, before the inspector could sign off on the rebar. "It's fine, Eli. It's just a formality," he'd said, flashing that easy smile that made you feel like you were the one being unreasonable. I'd refused, of course. My name wasn't on the deed, but it was on the soul of this structure, and I wouldn't have it built on a lie. Now I saw that moment not as a point of pride, but as the first crack. His arrogance had been there all along, chafing against the unyielding reality of my code. I spent the next 3 days in a state of methodical, almost monastic preparation. The workshop was no longer a place of mourning, it was a command center. I cleaned and oiled every tool, the scents of linseed and metal of familiar incense. My table saw, my planer, my chisels, they were no longer just instruments of creation, they were weapons of truth. I sharpened them all, the rhythmic scrape of the honing steel a mantra that focused my mind. I wasn't just sharpening blades, I was sharpening my intent. My plan, however, remained infuriatingly abstract. I knew the weakness was in the foundation, specifically in the southeast corner where the soil had been a little too soft, where I'd recommended and been denied the extra expense of helical piers. Mark had opted for a thicker concrete pour, a cheap and lazy solution that addressed the symptom, not the cause. The house was settling. It had to be. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. I needed evidence and I needed to get inside. The opportunity came on a Tuesday. Sarah, my daughter, called. Her voice was tight with a familiar, weary tension. "Dad, Mark and I are taking the kids to my in-laws for the weekend. The alarm company is coming to do their annual service on Friday. I know it's a lot to ask, but could you maybe let them in? You still have the code, and you know the system better than we do." I parked my old truck a block away and walked to the house I'd built. It stood there on the manicured lot, a monument of sleek lines and tasteful stonework, beautiful and utterly blind to the rot beneath. My heart hammered against my ribs. A traitorous drumbeat of the old man, the grieving father. I silenced it. I was a craftsman on a job. I keyed in the code, Sarah's birthday, and the lock disengaged with a soft click. The silence inside was profound, the kind of expensive quiet that money buys. It smelled of lemony polish and new upholstery. I didn't let myself look at the family photos on the wall, at the echoes of my grandchildren's laughter frozen in time. I had a job to do. I went straight to the southeast corner of the house, to the guest room they never used. This was where the whisper would be the loudest. I pulled a marble from my pocket, a perfect glass sphere I'd taken from my workshop. I placed it on the pristine oak floorboards and held my breath. For a moment, nothing. Then, with an almost imperceptible slowness, it began to roll. It traveled a clean, unwavering 6 inches before coming to a stop against the baseboard. A 6-inch slope in a 20-foot room. It was more than a whisper. It was a declaration. I got down on my hands and knees, my carpenter's eye scanning the details the decorator had tried to hide. There it was, a hairline crack, no thicker than a thread, snaking its way up the drywall from the floor, cleverly concealed by the shadow of a tall dresser. I ran my finger along it, feeling the slight, gritty texture of the fractured plaster. This was the proof. This was the first verse of the foundation song, but it wasn't enough. A crack could be patched, explained away as seasonal shifting. I needed the groan. I needed the sound. I went to the interior wall, the one that should have been plumb and true. I braced my shoulder against it, took a deep breath, and pushed. At first, there was nothing but the solid resistance of a well-built frame. I pushed harder, putting my full weight into it, my muscles straining. And then I heard it. A low, deep, almost mournful groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. It was the sound of stressed wood, of nails bending in their sockets, of a structure under a strain it was never designed to bear. I stood up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was talking, and I was the only one who could translate. I left before the alarm technicians arrived, the evidence I'd gathered now a living, breathing thing inside me. I had the slope. I had the crack. I had the sound. I had the first 3 notes of a symphony of collapse. Now, I just had to decide when to conduct the finale. I started my investigation quietly, methodically, building my case not with computers or private eyes, but with the tools I had honed over a lifetime. The ability to read the silent language of wood, concrete, and earth. My first stop was the county records office, a place that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic dust. I still had a few old contacts there, men who remembered me from the big custom home jobs and who didn't ask too many questions. I told them I was consulting on a property in the old neighborhood, a little white lie that felt greasy on my tongue. They let me into the back, and I pulled the original geological surveys and permit applications for their property. The survey was a masterpiece of optimistic omission. It noted moderate soil variability, but failed to chart the underground spring that my own, more experienced eyes knew had to be there. The same one that plagued the lots at the bottom of the ridge. The permit applications were even more telling. I cross-referenced them with my own notes, with the memory of the land before the first foundation was poured. The original plans called for a significantly more extensive piling system, but a subsequent revision, approved by an inspector whose name I didn't recognize, had scaled it back to cut costs. They'd built a palace on a budget foundation. Knowledge was one thing, proof was another. I needed to see the bones of the house under stress, not just hear its groans. Under the flimsy guise of picking up some old tools I'd left behind, I called them, my voice a careful mask of casual friendliness. I timed it for a Tuesday afternoon, when I knew they'd both be at work, the house sitting empty and silent. Letting myself in with the key they'd never asked for back felt like a violation, a trespass that tightened my chest. The air inside was still and smelled of their life, lemon polish and floral perfume. I ignored it. I wasn't there to look at the fine finishes, the curated art, the life they'd built on my ruin. I went straight to the basement door, the one hidden off the kitchen pantry. The air grew cold and damp as I descended, the scent changing to one of dank earth and concrete. I flicked on my high-powered work light, the beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate the crawl space and the foundational walls. This was the truth of the house, stripped of all decoration. I got down on my belly, the gritty floor cold against my chest, and crawled into the space. It was a tight, dark world of spiderwebs and insulated pipes. I played my flashlight beam over the poured concrete of the foundation, and there they were. The hairline stress fractures I knew would appear. They weren't the dramatic, jagged cracks of a sudden failure, but something more insidious. A delicate, almost beautiful web of fine lines spreading from the corner of the pilings, like capillaries on a feverish cheek. I took precise photos, the camera flash freezing each minute detail. I documented the subtle shifts and signs of settling that only a trained eye would ever notice. I measured the gap where a floor joist was slowly pulling away from its metal hanger, a quarter-inch of space that screamed of movement. I placed my level against the main support beam and watched the bubble float decisively, definitively, away from center. Back in the main basement, I found the crown jewel of my deceit. A section of the drywall on the interior foundation wall had a faint, persistent dampness at its base. It was hidden behind a stack of plastic-wrapped Christmas decorations. Using my pocket knife, I carefully peeled back a corner of the damp drywall. The paper backing was stained a dark brown, and the insulation behind it was wet and matted, a slow, weeping seepage from the cracked foundation wall beyond. It wasn't a flood. It was a chronic, incurable illness. I took more photos, my hands steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. This was more than a structural flaw. It was a latent catastrophe waiting for the next big rain. As I crawled back out, dusting the cobwebs from my shoulders, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The symphony was now complete in my mind. I had the geological surveys, the compromised permits, the photographic evidence of the fractures, the damp rot, and the measurable slope. I had the memory of the marble's roll and the house's mournful groan. Each piece was an instrument tuned to a note of failure. I stood in their quiet kitchen, the evidence a cold, hard weight in my pocket, and looked out at their perfect backyard. I was the only one who could hear the music playing beneath the surface, a slow, grinding dirge. And I was the only one who knew when the crescendo would come. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, a greasy film congealing on its surface. I'd been staring into the murky depths for 20 minutes, the diner's vinyl booth squeaking every time I shifted my weight. The evidence was a phantom limb, a constant throbbing presence in my mind. I could feel the cold, hard drive in my pocket, a digital tomb for a dying house. The photos were seared onto the back of my eyelids. The quarter-inch gap, the weeping foundation, the defiant tilt of the bubble in my level. "You look like you just lost your best friend." He slid in, the booth groaning in protest. "Talk to me." I told him about the dampness behind the Christmas decorations, the chronic seepage that was the house's hidden, weeping sore. I didn't just tell him, I showed him, pulling out my phone and scrolling through the damning gallery. Frank listened, his grizzled face impassive. He didn't interrupt, just sipped his coffee. His eyes, the color of weathered concrete, fixed on me. When I finished, the silence hung between us, thick with the weight of it all. He set his cup down with a soft, definitive click. The affable retiree was gone, replaced by the city inspector who had seen it all. His face hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening into grooves of pure contempt. "Mark," I said, supplying the name. "Mark Roberts. They don't just cut corners. They redesign the whole damn shape and dare you to call it a circle. They think the code is a suggestion, a list of inconvenient poetry." He leaned forward, his voice dropping, grim and focused. "This kind of negligence, son, it's not just insulting, it's dangerous. It's a promise of failure written in wet concrete and rotten wood." "Let me see that phone again." The marble roll wasn't a quirk, it was a measurable deviation from plane. The groaning wasn't the house settling, it was differential movement between the subfloor and the load-bearing members. My latent catastrophe became Section R406 of the Residential Code, addressing foundation wall requirements for damp-proofing and structural integrity. My compromised permits became a demonstrable pattern of non-compliance with approved site grading plans. You have to be more precise, more by the book than they are. You go in with a binder full of code violations, cross-referenced with photographic evidence and professional-grade annotations that gets a file opened. The music I heard was no longer just beneath the surface of the house. It was now a composition being transcribed, note by perfect damning note, onto official letterhead. The crescendo was still coming, but now I had a conductor. My first move was indirect. Using a burner phone purchased with cash from a sketchy kiosk 3 towns over, I sent an anonymous text to the publicly listed number for the Sycamore Glen Homeowners Association. My fingers, clumsy on the cheap plastic keys, didn't mention Mark by name. That would have been too obvious, a direct accusation that could be traced back to a personal grudge. Instead, I channeled Frank. I became a concerned, pedantic citizen. "Be advised," I typed, the words sounding like his in my head. "A cost-saving construction shortcut involving substandard perimeter drainage and compromised damp-proofing is becoming popular with some contractors. Given soil saturation levels from recent precipitation events, this creates a significant risk of differential settlement and foundation wall failure. Recommend a review of recent project approvals for compliance with Section R406. Assume they can trace everything," he'd said. "Assume they are better at it than you are, so don't be you, be a ghost." She'd taken the dry, bureaucratic warning and translated it into the vibrant language of suburban panic. "Dear neighbors," her email began, "you may have noticed some unusual cracking in your drywall or doors that won't close properly. The HOA has received a professional tip about shoddy construction practices that could be affecting our homes. Some builders are cutting corners on foundations. With all this rain, our biggest investment could be at risk. The board is urging everyone to review their property surveys and be vigilant." The seed wasn't just planted, it had been watered with pure anxiety and was already sprouting. That evening, I saw the ripple effect firsthand. I was taking out my trash when I saw Mr. Henderson from 2 houses down, on his hands and knees, peering at the foundation of his brand-new sunroom with a flashlight. A few hours later, I heard the distinct, angry tenor of a man arguing on the phone through an open window. "I don't care what the warranty says, David. If this house starts sinking, it's on you." The name, David, was Mark's primary business partner. This was the background radiation I needed, a generalized, neighborhood-wide sense of unease. It was the perfect camouflage for my next, more targeted strike. Frank called it laying the bed. You don't just drop the accusation, you first create a context where it seems inevitable, almost expected. I spent the next 3 days in the basement, not as a terrified homeowner, but as a forensic archivist. I was transcribing the symphony. Following Frank's blueprint, I created the binder. It was a 3-inch thick black leviathan of a thing. The first section was a timeline, a cold chronological list of every interaction with Mark, from the first charming handshake to the final evasive text message. Each entry was footnoted with a corresponding document, the contract, the permit applications, and the ones I later discovered were never filed, the email chains. The second section was the heart of it, the code violations. I didn't just write bad foundation. I cited, with Frank's help, the specific numbered clauses. Violation of IRC R403.1.8. Minimum compressive strength requirements for concrete foundations not met, as evidenced by spalling and powdering at the northeast corner. See Photo Annex 1.4, 1.7. I had close-ups of the crumbling concrete, a ruler in the frame for scale. Violation of IRC R406.2. Damp proofing application inconsistent and incomplete, failing to provide a continuous barrier against moisture migration. See Photo Annex 2.1, 2.9. I had a horrifying series of photos showing the weeping black stain that spread up the wall after a heavy rain. The final section was the Photo Annex, a gallery of my house's quiet suffering. Every cracked joist, every out-of-level floor, every warped door frame was documented with the dispassionate clarity of a crime scene investigator. I didn't feel the dread anymore when I looked at them. I felt a surge of power. These weren't my failures, they were his. They were exhibits. The night before I was to deliver the binder to the Department of Building Standards, I laid it all out on my kitchen table. The binder, the digital files copied onto 3 separate thumb drives, and a notarized sworn affidavit I'd written myself. The table, usually littered with unopened mail and a lonely coffee mug, looked like a war room. This was my army. This was my meticulously composed score. I ran my hand over the binder's cool, smooth cover. This was no longer a dirge. Frank was right. This was a formal composition, and I was ready to conduct. The anonymous tip to the HOA had been the quiet, unsettling overture. Tomorrow would be the first movement, played not in my crumbling basement, but in the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of bureaucracy. I picked up the binder. It was heavy. It was solid. It was the undeniable truth, and I was going to swing it like a hammer. Just as I predicted, Mark's arrogance made him careless. At the next Sunday dinner, he bragged about the HOA memo, laughing about how his idiot neighbors were panicking. I told the contractor to ignore that old-fashioned nonsense. He boasted, looking right at me. Saved us a bundle and the house is perfect. Some people just don't understand modern efficiency. My daughter nodded along, smiling proudly at her savvy husband. He had just handed me his confession on a silver platter, confirming his willful negligence in front of witnesses. Sarah's smile widened, misinterpreting my calm for acquiescence. She saw a placated mother. She didn't see the archivist cataloguing evidence. The binder was already with the Department of Building Standards, of course. I'd delivered it 2 days prior, handing the heavy black tome to a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read D. Evans. The act had been strangely anticlimactic. There was no fanfare, no sudden shift in the atmosphere. Just the soft thud of the binder on the counter, the squeak of D. Evans' pen as she filled out a receipt, and the sterile hum of the fluorescent lights. I had walked out feeling not triumphant, but surgical. The first incision had been made. Now, we waited for the infection to surface. A week passed, then another. The silence was a test of my own resolve. Every day I expected a phone call, from Mark, from Sarah, from some lawyer with a booming voice and empty threats. But my phone remained stubbornly quiet. I started to wonder if the binder had been lost, shuffled into some bureaucratic black hole, its pages of damning evidence fading into obscurity. The fear began to creep back in. The old, familiar dread that this was all a futile exercise, that men like Mark always won. But then, on a Tuesday morning, I saw the white city truck with the official seal on the door parked across the street. A man in a hard hat and a neon yellow vest was walking around Mark's property, a clipboard in his hand. He wasn't just glancing, he was studying. He spent a long time at the northeast corner of the foundation, kneeling down, his nose almost touching the spalling concrete I had so meticulously photographed. He ran his fingers over the weeping stain on the basement wall, the one that looked like a Rorschach test of failure. I watched from my living room window, the lace curtain of fragile screen between me and the theater of consequence. My heart wasn't pounding with panic, it was beating a steady, determined rhythm. This was the second movement, the adagio of assessment. The doorbell rang at my daughter's house. I saw Sarah answer, her posture initially welcoming, then shifting to confusion as the inspector spoke. Mark appeared behind her, his frame filling the doorway. Even from a distance, I could read the change in his posture. The usual relaxed slouch tightened into a rigid line of defensiveness. He started to gesture, his movements sharp and dismissive. I couldn't hear the words, but the pantomime was clear. He was trying to talk his way out of it. He was trying to charm, to bully, to dismiss. But the man in the vest didn't move. He just nodded, his pen never stopping its journey across the form on his clipboard. That evening the phone finally rang. It was Sarah. Her voice wasn't angry, not yet. It was thin and frayed, laced with a confusion so profound it sounded like static. "Mom, did you see a city inspector at the house today? A formal violation. He said someone filed a complaint with documentation." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath as the pieces began to click into place in her mind. The HOA memo I'd warned them about, my quiet obsession with their new home's flaws, my silence at dinner. "Mom," she said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper, "was it you?" The war room had been dismantled, the army deployed. The silence on my end of the line was my answer. It was heavy. It was solid. It was the undeniable truth, and I had finally swung it. The sharp intake of breath from Sarah's end was a tiny, wounded thing. It was the sound of a world fracturing. Then the line went dead. Not a slam, not a curse, just a sudden, absolute void of sound that was louder than any scream. I held the phone to my ear for a long moment, listening to the dial tone's dull hum, a flat line confirming what I had done. I had expected her fury. I had braced for it, my own spine steeled against the coming storm of her accusations. But this silence, this was worse. It was the sound of a bridge, not burning in a glorious defiant blaze, but crumbling, stone by stone, into an uncrossable chasm. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling only slightly. The calm I had felt moments before curdled into a cold, leaden weight in my stomach. My eyes drifted back to the kitchen table, to the single, unopened envelope. It was my own mortgage statement. A mundane reminder of a life built on solid, if unremarkable, ground. A life where I paid my bills and followed the rules. I had done this for her, everything always for her, to protect her from the shoddy craftsmanship of a man who thought charm was a suitable substitute for a load-bearing wall. The creation of the report had been a grim, satisfying ritual. Frank, my stoic, reliable neighbor who'd spent 40 years in civil engineering, was my reluctant accomplice. I brought him the geological survey I'd dug up from the county archives, the one Mark had dismissed as boring government paperwork. Frank whistled, a low, soft sound of professional dismay. "Well, I'll be damned, Mike," he said, as I showed him the photos I'd taken with my old digital camera, zooming in on the hairline cracks, snaking up from the base of the house like dark veins. I even presented my own ledger, open to the page where my neat looping script had recorded the official HOA warning. Frank had whistled, a low, soft sound of professional dismay. "Well, I'll be damned, Eleanor," he'd said, tapping a thick, work-roughened finger on the photo of the largest fracture near the patio. That's not just settling, that's a failure. He sketched out the likely failure points, cited the specific building codes, Section R403.1.7 on footings, Chapter 4 on foundations, that had been blatantly ignored. His analysis was a thing of brutal beauty, a clinical autopsy of a house that was still technically breathing. I was the one who compiled it all, the archivist of the coming disaster. I used the public library's computer, my fingers clumsy on the keys, to type up the formal complaint. I titled it with a grim sense of irony, Structural Concerns Regarding 1847 Laurel Creek Drive. Anonymous. I made sure of that. Not out of cowardice, I told myself, but out of strategy. An anonymous, meticulously documented complaint from a concerned citizen would carry more weight than one from a disgruntled mother-in-law. It would force them to look at the facts, not the family drama. The final document was a masterpiece of destruction. 23 pages. It included the geological survey, my photos with timestamps, Frank's damning analysis, and a copy of the HOA memo. It laid out, in irrefutable detail, how Mark's beautiful, hasty dream was built on a literal flaw. I printed it on the library's laser printer, the pages warm and smelling of toner. The act of sliding those pages into a large manila envelope felt sacramental. I drove to the main post office across town, the package heavy on the passenger seat. As I dropped it into the mailbox designated for city government, the metal slot clanged shut with a sound of finality. The deed was done. The wheels were in motion. Now, standing in the ringing silence of my own kitchen, the righteousness I had clung to began to flake away, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath. I hadn't just reported a house. I had declared war on my daughter's happiness. I had chosen concrete and code over the fragile living thing that was her trust. I looked at my reflection in the dark window over the sink. My face was pale, my expression unreadable even to myself. The war room was gone. The battle was joined. And for the first time, I wondered if the victory, if it ever came, would be a hollow one, found in the ruins of everything I had actually been fighting for. The phone in my hand felt like a weapon, and I was the one who had been struck by it. The city acted with a speed that was both gratifying and terrifying. The certified letter, stark and official, arrived at Mark and Sarah's house less than a week after I dropped my own envelope into the void. It didn't just suggest, it mandated. A Level 3 structural inspection, the most severe category to be conducted by a city-appointed engineer within 10 business days. There would be no shopping for a friendly opinion. The wheels I had set in motion were not just turning, they were thundering downhill. The panic that erupted was a physical force I could feel through the phone lines, through the very walls of our neighboring houses. Sarah's first call was a torrent of confused, tearful questions. "Mom, what's happening? They're saying the house is unsafe. He's losing his mind." Her voice was a fragile thread, and I clutched the receiver, my knuckles white, the taste of my own betrayal like ash in my mouth. I played my part, the concerned, ignorant mother. "I don't know, sweetheart. It must be a mistake. A mix-up with the permits, maybe." The lie was slick and poisonous. Mark, trapped and furious, did the only thing his ego would allow. He deflected blame. He didn't skulk or whisper. He went for a public execution. The summons came via a group text from Sarah, a chirpy, obviously dictated message about a family BBQ to clear the air and figure things out. The subtext was a scream. I knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, what it truly was. He had called a large family gathering, including Sarah's uncles and aunts who had, until now, been his grudging fans, with the clear intention of publicly accusing me of shoddy work and trying to paint me as an incompetent old man responsible for the crisis. The day of the gathering dawned unnaturally bright, the sky a mocking cloudless blue. I dressed with the care of a soldier putting on armor, dark slacks, a simple button-down shirt, nothing that could be construed as emotional or frail. I looked in the mirror and saw the pale, unreadable face from the kitchen window again. The strategist was gone. In her place was a prisoner walking to the gallows, guilty of the crime but terrified of the sentence. The air at their house was thick with a false, strained cheer. The smell of charcoal and grilling meat was undercut by the sharp tang of anxiety. My sister-in-law Carol gave me a tight, sympathetic hug, while my brother David just nodded gravely, his arms crossed. They were on my side, I knew, but their side was simply family, and they didn't yet know this was a battlefield. Sarah flitted between guests, a tense hostess, her smile not reaching her eyes. And Mark stood by the grill, a king holding court over a kingdom he knew was crumbling. He held a spatula like a scepter, his laughter too loud, his gestures too broad. The meal was a pantomime. We ate overcooked burgers and potato salad, making stilted conversation about the weather, about work, about anything but the certified letter that was surely sitting on their kitchen counter. A silent bomb. I could feel Mark's eyes on me, measuring, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was savoring this, the build-up, the assuredness of his own narrative. Finally, as paper plates were being collected and the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, he made his move. He tapped his beer bottle with a fork, the dull clink silencing the scattered conversations. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," he began, his voice oozing a false pained reasonableness. "As you know, we've hit a little snag with the city. Some bureaucratic nonsense, a mandatory inspection." He waved a hand, as if shooing a fly. "But I didn't call you all here just to complain. I want to be transparent. I think we have a responsibility to get to the bottom of how this happened, and the only variable, the only part of this project that wasn't handled by licensed, certified professionals," he let the sentence hang in the smoky air, "was the foundational grading and soil prep, the very base upon which everything else was built. But we all know Elaine helped us out tremendously in the beginning. She was here every day, running that skid steer, doing us a huge favor to save money. And we are, so grateful." The words were syrup, but his eyes were daggers. "The problem is, the city's complaint. It specifically cites improper compaction and unapproved fill material at the foundation level. That was your work, Elaine, your work." Sarah was staring at me, her face a canvas of dawning horror and confusion. "Mom," he didn't know the public stage he had chosen was the very trap I had laid. He had just handed me the microphone, and the spotlight was finally, perfectly, on the truth. "That was your work, Mark. Your work." He had expected tears, denials, the flustered panic of a cornered animal. He did not expect the serene stillness of a spider whose web has finally been touched. All eyes were on me, a circle of judgment and confusion. Sarah's was the only one that cut, her gaze a physical weight of hurt and bewildered betrayal. "Mom?" she whispered again, the word a plea for an explanation that would make this nightmare make sense. I held her eyes for a moment, a silent promise, before turning my attention back to Mark. My voice, when it came, was calm, devoid of the tremor he so desperately wanted to hear. "Improper compaction," I repeated, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "And unapproved fill material. You're certain that was my work, Mark? You've gone over every invoice, every report." "The certified work starts after. The foundation was set. Your name isn't on any of the official paperwork for that phase, because you were just helping out. A favor, remember?" He said the word favor like it was a synonym for sabotage. I remember the mud, a churning, bottomless sea of it. And I remember you, Mark, coming to me, your voice full of frantic urgency. The schedule was slipping. The budget was bleeding. The certified operator had walked off the job, you said. Could I help? Could I just get the pad leveled and stabilized so the concrete crew could pour? You begged me. I said that. Mark's father, Gerald, shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. "What trucks?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "The trucks that came at night," I said, my gaze locking with Mark's. He had gone very still. After I'd gone home, exhausted. Big rumbling dump trucks, their beds filled with, what was it you called it, Mark? Clean, structural fill. A steal of a price, you said. You directed them where to dump it. You told me the next morning that you'd found a way to build up the pad, to save us from having to bring in more expensive, engineered fill. You were so proud of your resourcefulness. It remembers what it's made of. It remembers how it was treated. And it tells its secrets if you know how to listen. I reached slowly into the large canvas bag I'd dropped by the door when I entered. I pulled out a small, clear plastic jar. Inside was a packed, dark, granular substance. This is a sample from the core the city inspectors took. This one contained a lighter, grainy, almost ashy material with bits of brick and concrete in it. And this, I said, my voice gaining a new sharp edge, is a sample I took myself from the pile of clean structural fill you had delivered from that demolition site over in the old industrial park. The one with the known history of chemical contamination. The one whose material is explicitly banned from use in residential foundation fill without extensive and expensive remediation. You were so busy being the project manager, you never noticed the curious widow poking around the material stockpiles after hours, because you documented it all so beautifully, including the make and license plate of those midnight dump trucks and the record of my text messages with you, Mark, where you explicitly told me not to worry about the strange-looking fill and to just pack it down good. I'm the structural engineer here for the preliminary assessment. And I believe, I said, my eyes finding Mark's once more, holding him in the spotlight he had so graciously provided. We are finally ready to unearth the truth. The man from the porch, the structural engineer with the company polo and the tablet, took a hesitant step inside. Hello? I'm looking for a Mark Evans. I'm the city's chief structural engineer, here for the preliminary assessment. In here, given the nature of the allegations and the potential public safety risk, we expedited a preliminary review of the available site plans and material manifests. I've just come from a quick external visual inspection. The concrete footings are showing significant stress fractures that align precisely with the settlement cracks visible on your interior walls. The anonymous report we received was remarkably accurate, the engineer stated, his voice low and serious as his eyes scanned our faces, lingering for a moment on my tool bag before moving on. It was written by someone with an expert's understanding of this home's specific construction flaws. It detailed not just the what, but the how and the when. There was no accusation in their gazes now, only a desperate, hungry need for an anchor in this crumbling reality. Mark found his voice, a ragged, broken thing. This is a setup. I unzipped the main compartment, the sound loud in the hush, and pulled out not the black composition notebook of my daily site diary, but something older, more foundational. It was my original project ledger, a heavy leather-bound book filled with my neat architectural script, every calculation and observation from the very first sketch to the final, fateful argument. The leather was soft and worn from years of handling. I opened it with a reverence I truly felt, the spine cracking softly. I turned to the bookmarked page, a sheet filled with stress load calculations and a rough, angry sketch I'd drawn the day I'd been forced off my own project. I held it up, not for the engineer, not for Sarah, but for Mark. I wanted him to see the proof of his own folly in my own hand, written long before his greed had fully taken root. I warned him, I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the room like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute truth. On page 43, dated July 18th, I wrote, "The proposed change in fill material for Lot 7 is a catastrophic shortcut. The clay-heavy soil is highly expansive and will compromise the hydraulic pressure on the foundation walls. The house will fail." I told him his shortcut would compromise the very soul of this house, that it wasn't a home he was building, but a tomb for a family's dreams, that my concerns were quaint and impractical. He told me to stick to my drawings and let the real men handle the dirt. Evans, this ledger, along with the report and the state agency's material analysis, provides compelling evidence of gross negligence and deliberate code violations. This investigation will be escalated immediately. A full structural condemnation is likely. All that was left was a hollow man watching the walls, both literal and figurative, close in on him. The truth wasn't just being unearthed. It was erupting, and it was burying him alive. The engineer took my ledger, his hands, calloused and stained with the honest grime of his own work, treating the worn leather cover with a reverence Mark had never shown. His eyes, sharp and technical, scanned my handwritten notes, my carefully drawn diagrams of soil compaction and water table fluctuations. I saw them widen, not in surprise, but in a grim, professional validation. He compared my scrawled warnings to the cold, hard data on his tablet, his jaw tightening. "It's all here," he said, his voice low and devoid of all professional neutrality. He looked at Mark not as a homeowner in distress, but with pure, unadulterated disgust. A deliberate, documented deviation from the approved plans, executed against the written prophetic advice of your primary contractor. And then, the coup de grace. Because the evidence pointed to willful, knowing negligence, their insurance policy was null and void. A clause, he explained, for those who actively court disaster. Mark's financial world didn't just collapse, it vaporized. I watched the calculations flicker behind his eyes, the second mortgage, the lines of credit he'd bragged about leveraging, the promises he'd made to Sarah of a pool, of vacations, of a future built on this very sand. His face, already pale, turned a sickly gray. The confident bluster that had once dismissed me as a quaint artist was gone, replaced by the raw terror of a man realizing the ground beneath his feet was not just unstable, but actively crumbling. He was exposed, utterly and completely, not as a savvy businessman, but as a cheap, arrogant fraud. A sound escaped Sarah, a sharp, choked gasp that was worse than any scream. She wasn't looking at the engineer or at me. Her entire being was focused on her husband, her gaze a laser of horrified comprehension. "You knew," she whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of a collapsing roof. "All those arguments. My worries about the cracks in the garage. You told me I was being dramatic. You told me it was just the house settling." Her voice gained strength, fueled by a torrent of betrayal. "You looked me in the eye and you called me dramatic while you knew. You knew it was falling apart." The engineer, his duty a cold, formal thing, began packing his equipment. "I'll file the preliminary report with the county by end of day today. You'll receive a formal condemnation notice. You cannot stay here. The risk of a foundation wall failure, especially with the forecasted rain, is too great." This was the moment I had played over in my mind for years, the moment of vindication. But the victory was ash in my mouth. I saw the tremble in Sarah's hands as she wrapped her arms around herself. I saw the utter desolation in the set of her shoulders. This wasn't just Mark's ruin. It was hers, their children's. The family's dreams I had tried to protect were not saved. They were being publicly dismantled, and the spectacle was horrifying. Mark finally found his voice, a broken, raspy thing. There must be something. A retrofit, Piers, something. He was begging. The project manager reduced to a supplicant. The engineer shook his head, not unkindly, but with finality. "The prescribed solution for this level of failure is to demolish and rebuild from a properly engineered foundation. The cost would exceed the value of the property." I'm sorry. He wasn't sorry for Mark. He was sorry for the brutal, unassailable truth of physics and finance. He turned to me, handing back the ledger as if returning a sacred text. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley. Your diligence, it may have saved them from a physical catastrophe." His meaning was clear. The financial and emotional catastrophe was already upon them. As the engineer left, the silence he left behind was thick and suffocating. The three of us stood in the grand foyer, the high ceiling now feeling like the lid of a press. Mark sank onto the bottom step of the curved staircase, his head in his hands. He was a hollow man, his arrogance scoured away by the acid of truth, leaving only a cavern of shame. Sarah looked at me, her eyes brimming with a pain so profound it made me flinch. "You tried to tell him," she said, her voice trembling. "All that time ago you tried." It was the sound of a man watching his own ghost walk away from him. His shoulders, usually set in a defiant, almost arrogant square, collapsed inward, making him seem small and shockingly young on the bottom step of that grand, curving staircase. The high ceiling which he'd once bragged about now seemed to press down on all of us, a domed tomb for his ambitions. "You have to," he choked out, his voice thick with tears and desperation. He wasn't looking at Sarah or our daughter anymore. His entire world had shrunk to me, the ghost from his past, who held the only key, even if that key no longer fit the lock. "Mike, please. You're the only one who understands. Tell them you were wrong. Tell them you can shore it up. There has to be a way. A retrofit, piers, something. God, there has to be something." The engineer's words hung in the air, more solid than the plaster and lathe around us. Demolish and rebuild from a properly engineered foundation. There was no arguing with the brutal poetry of that sentence. It was a verdict, not a suggestion. My daughter, Sarah, stood frozen near the archway to the dining room, a place I imagined had seen countless carefully curated dinners. Her face was a mask of pale shock, but her eyes were alive, darting between her broken father and me, the stranger who had wielded the wrecking ball. I saw the calculation in her gaze, the frantic re-evaluation of every family story, every casual dismissal of that old ledger your father left. The perfect life she'd known was not just cracked, it was exposed as a stage set, and the flats were tipping over one by one. She took a single step toward Chloe, placing a hand on her arm, a silent command to stay, to witness. Then her gaze, brimming with a pain so profound it felt like a physical weight, settled on me. "You tried to tell him," she repeated, her voice a low, trembling thread in the suffocating silence. "All that time ago you tried." I'd stood in a cramped office, a younger man with ink-stained fingers, pointing to the columns of numbers that didn't add up, the invoices for materials that were never delivered, the subcontractors who didn't exist. Mark had laughed then, a confident, dismissive sound. He'd called me jealous, petty, unable to understand his grand vision. He'd told Sarah I was trying to sabotage his success, to poison what they were building together. And she, caught in the dazzling glare of his ambition, had believed him. Now, I just nodded, the weight of that old, dismissed truth heavier than ever. I had wanted vindication. I had wanted her to see the man he really was, but this felt like a shared execution. I had unearthed the truth, and now we were all standing in the crater it left behind, breathing the dust of a home, a marriage, and a man's very identity. Mark's sobs subsided into ragged, hiccuping breaths. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a childish gesture that was heartbreaking on a man of his age and former stature. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "It was for them," he whispered, the words meant for me alone. All of it. The bigger house, the better neighborhood. I just wanted to give them everything I never had. Everything you couldn't. He had built this beautiful, rotting shell not out of greed, but out of a desperate, competitive love. He had to be better than me, to provide more than I ever could, and in his frantic race, he'd cut every corner he could find. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice shockingly steady. It was the tone she used to use when Chloe would fall and scrape a knee, a calm that belied the chaos. "This wasn't for us. This was for you." The last remaining pillar of his justification crumbled. Just then, a new sound intruded upon our private apocalypse. The low, grinding rumble of heavy machinery from outside. The demolition crew was arriving, right on the city's unforgiving schedule. The official, who had been a silent, uncomfortable spectator, cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, for safety reasons, you have 1 hour to remove any remaining personal effects you deem critical. After that, this structure is condemned." But the blind idolatry for her father was gone, replaced by a dawning, awful clarity. I was no hero in this story. I was just the man who'd read the obituary aloud. That left Mark and me in the ruins. He slowly pushed himself to his feet, his movements those of an old man. He didn't look at me again. He just stared at the front door, at the sliver of daylight visible through the crack, as the engine of the excavator outside roared to life, a beast waiting to be fed. He was a hollow man, his arrogance scoured away by the acid of truth, leaving only a cavern of shame. And I was the one who had poured the acid. Justice, I thought, tastes an awful lot like ashes. The silence I left behind in the foyer was a physical thing, a heavy velvet curtain falling on a play that had run too long. I didn't need to see their faces, Mark's hollowed-out shame, Sarah's quiet devastation, Chloe's shattered gaze, to feel the shape of their ruin. It was complete. The low, guttural growl of the excavator idling at the curb was the only eulogy this house would get. I walked down the winding driveway, the gravel crunching a steady final rhythm under my boots. My old leather tool bag, a familiar comforting weight in my hand, swung gently at my side. I had looked at the weeping man and my heartbroken daughter, and felt nothing but a quiet, solemn finality. My work is in that ledger. It was sound, I'd said to the engineer, ignoring Mark completely. The words were not a boast, but a simple, unassailable fact, laid down like a cornerstone. As I stepped from the shadow of the house I had built and into the cool evening air, I didn't feel vengeful or triumphant. I simply felt the return of my own gravity, my own solid ground. For years, I had been orbiting Mark Thorne's sun, my own light dimmed by his brilliance, my own trajectory bent by his needs. Now the tether was cut. The air outside didn't smell of plaster dust and regret. It smelled of coming rain and damp earth. It was real. I reached my truck, an old Ford that had seen more honest work than Mark's entire investment firm. I opened the door, the creak of its hinge a familiar song. I tossed the tool bag onto the passenger seat, where it belonged. For a moment I just stood there, one hand on the doorframe, and looked back. The house, my opus, stood silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. It was still beautiful. The lines were clean, the proportions perfect. It was a good house. He had just been a bad man to live in it. From this distance I could see the yellow arm of the excavator, a predatory insect poised to strike. The front door was still ajar, and in that sliver of darkness I saw a flicker of movement. Sarah emerged, her arms wrapped around a cardboard box. She didn't look at the machine or at me. She walked to their sleek, expensive car, placed the box in the trunk with a weary finality, and went back inside. A moment later, Chloe came out, clutching a tattered teddy bear by one arm. She stopped on the front step, her small frame rigid. She wasn't crying. She was just staring at the machine, her young face a mask of a new, unwelcome understanding. She saw the world now, not as a place of fairy tales where her father was the king, but as a place where things could be broken beyond repair. I had done that. I was the one who had read the obituary aloud. The thought was a cold stone in my gut. My vindication was real, my restored dignity a coat that fit me again, but it was lined with the chill of her lost innocence. Justice, I had thought, tastes like ashes. Now, I realized it also smells like a little girl's heartbreak. The engine of the excavator roared, a deeper, more committed sound. It was time. I slid into the driver's seat, the worn leather welcoming me. I didn't start the engine. I couldn't. This was a funeral, and you don't drive away from a graveside before the casket is lowered. I watched as the Thorne family filed out for the last time. Mark walked like a ghost, his shoulders slumped, his expensive suit looking like a costume he'd forgotten to take off. He didn't help Sarah with the last of the boxes. He just stood by the car, a statue of defeat. Sarah ushered Chloe into the back seat, a protective hand on her head, before getting in herself. Their car started, and with a quiet, unceremonious purr, it pulled away. Mark didn't look back, not once. The excavator lumbered forward. The massive steel bucket, toothy and brutal, rose into the air. It hung there for a breath, a moment of silent, terrible anticipation. Then it swung forward and took its first bite out of the bay window. The sound was not a crash, but a deep, groaning shudder, the sound of wood and bone breaking. Glass exploded inward, a cloud of dust, the ghost of the home, puffed out into the twilight. I watched, my hands resting on the steering wheel, as the bucket tore into the clapboard siding, as it splintered the porch railing I had turned on a lathe, as it reduced my careful joinery to kindling. It was violence. It was ugly, and with every tearing, grinding impact, a strange weight lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't joy. It was release. They weren't just demolishing a house. They were demolishing my obsession, my bitterness, my need for their acknowledgement. Every splintered 2x4 was a piece of my past being cleared away. I finally started the truck. The engine turned over with a reliable rumble. My hands, resting on the wheel, were rough, calloused, and clean. My collar was blue, and it would always be blue. I had built something that was meant to last, and he had broken it. But as I put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb, the destructive cacophony fading behind me, I understood a new truth. He was left to live in the wreckage of his own making, while I was free to build something else. I had my dignity back, and tomorrow I had a job to go to.